ministry in Thessalonica. Well, the reason I told the story about the Thai football team, that was an illustration I used with our church. I think it illustrates the need for these three people that needed saving. They needed salvation. They were lost, the jailer, the slave girl, and Lydia. And God graciously sent a team to go deliver them and to give them the gospel and to plant a church in Philippi. And the ministry continues. Paul goes to Thessalonica. He goes to Berea. I don't have much to say on Thessalonica and Berea other than I don't think they were there a long time in Thessalonica. It says after Philippi, let me get the map up again. They traveled down from Philippi to Amphipolis to Apollonia to Thessalonica. I don't know honestly much about that. What I did pick up from my reading and study, I hadn't really thought about this before, and so it's interesting, I think, to think about this. Paul and Silas had just been beaten, injured, harmed in Philippi, and now they have to leave Philippi, and they have a long journey ahead of them. And once again, we see Paul on the road. This time, he doesn't talk about his eyes being the difficulty, but he's just been beaten. His feet have just been in stocks, and they have a long journey ahead. One commentator speculated that perhaps, this is speculation, but perhaps because Lydia was so wealthy, maybe she was able to give them some money so they could rent donkeys so that they could go on to Thessalonica. Luke doesn't tell us that, but it's just, I think it's helpful to meditate that these were real men. They were not angels. They were not super saints. Their bodies bled and hurt just like our bodies would, and yet the Spirit sustained them and helped them and brought them to other cities to share the gospel and to continue serving. And that's the way I would aspire to live. It's like Paul said to the Philippians. He doesn't consider himself to be at a certain place, and I'm not like there yet, but I ask the Lord, help me to be willing to take such sacrifices for the gospel. Before going to Thessalonica and Berea, though, that reminds me, what is the Philippian letter, the epistle, what is the church known for in that letter? There was a fight. I'm looking for something else, though. Before he gets to the fight in chapter 4, one thing that he talks about, more so it seems than many of the churches, is the joy that was in the Philippian church. Just look at Philippians chapter 1. There's not many churches, many epistles that Paul says this about. Philippians 1, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, verse 3. Verse 4, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making my prayer with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. Paul these people make him happy, give him joy. He loves these folks, and they were special to him. It says in chapter 4, the Philippian church gave him reason to rejoice because in verse 14, it was kind of them to share my trouble, Paul says, and you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my need once and again. And then there's a passage when he's talking to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 8. What verse? Okay. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. Philippi was a leading city. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty. Lydia was not extremely poor, but the churches are. Extreme poverty has overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. This Philippian church is a very special church that was impacted by the gospel. They're poor, they face trials, yet they have joy. I think that's good to know. This is the birth of this joyful church in the New Testament. And side note, but if you're ever in a position where you feel like your church needs preaching on joy, I would encourage you to go to the Philippian letter and to do a series in that letter. Okay, so Paul moved on to the Thessalonians. He's there for a number of weeks. He's preaching, and I want to show this verse. Sorry, I'm jumping around the New Testament. Look at 1 Thessalonians. What verse am I? Okay, here, chapter 2. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. For you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain. So this is Paul speaking of this trip now from Philippi to Thessalonica. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. So he faced a lot of conflict in the Thessalonian account. Let me read some of it. Acts 17, back to Acts 17, verse 2. Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them in Thessalonica from the Scriptures. This is right after he's been on the road, he's been hurt, he's weary. But he's explaining, in verse 3, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, not of the few leading women, but the Jews were jealous. Again, we see jealousy poisoning the Jews' mind and causing them to go after Paul and to persecute Paul. So we see jealousy, we see financial gain. Both of these reasons are driving persecution against the gospel, probably not terribly different from our own day. And then it says in verse 5, there's a rabble, they form a mob, they set Thessalonica in an uproar, they attack the house of a man named Jason, and so on and so forth. And Paul is driven from Thessalonica and is forced to go back on the road after preaching the gospel there. The next story is about Paul and Berea, and these two stories should be read together. So his ministry in Thessalonica is kind of both, I think contrasted is the right word, and also there's some comparison and contrast going on with what's going on in Berea. Immediately, Paul and Silas in verse 10, they go away by night to Berea, and they arrive, and again they go to the Jewish synagogue. These Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They're actually studying and trying to look into what Paul and Silas have to say. And then persecution again follows them to Berea. So even though there's a little bit of some more nobility here, some more gentle people here, those Thessalonian Jews come back and cause them trouble, and they're forced to leave Berea. Are there any thoughts on this before we move on to the section on Athens? I don't just want to rush over it, but well, it's interesting what you're saying, because in Philippians, Paul talks about, it appears he's talking, look at Philippians chapter, make sure I get it right, Philippians 1, verse 15. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only in that every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. My default, Issachar, would be that these Jews in Acts are not Christians, but we do know that Paul, later in life, when he wrote Philippians, was dealing with people who, at least in name, were Christian, preaching Christ from a selfish ambition, and they were causing Paul trouble. So I guess keep both of those things in mind. I think, too, whether these Jews I don't think they were Christians in 17 and in these chapters that caused him trouble. But even if they were in name only, what Paul's response to it is in Philippians is that I'm just thankful Christ is preached. And he rejoices in the Lord. But I think that these troublemakers in Thessalonica and Berea are just the angry Jews in the synagogue that wanted to kill him and cause him trouble. That make sense? Let's get into, okay, so they get to Athens. And Athens intrigues me a little bit. You know this, I mean, let's read it then. And then I want to talk about something. We'll read it, and then I'm going to ask you some questions, have you write some stuff down. Let's go ahead and read this, and what I want you to do as I'm reading, if you could take some notes, I want you to, after this, I want to talk about how did he engage pagans in a way that was different from the way he engaged the Jews and the God-fearers. So let me read this, take some notes down, we'll take some time, and then I want to talk about it. Because I think the lessons can inform our own evangelistic preaching. Verse 16, now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, okay, he's left Berea, the brothers have sent him away, and he's in Athens. His spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship is unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he's actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." What I was asking you to do, and what I'd like you just to take a few moments to do, is just write down, it doesn't have to be detailed thoughts, just the first things that come to your mind. This sermon is different than the sermon Paul preached to the Jews, where he started with Old Testament, Exodus, prophets, John the Baptist, Jesus. This sermon is different. I just like just a few thoughts that come to mind. Feel free to just jot them down about how this sermon is different, or you might think of it in terms of principles about how Paul engaged pagan non-Jews. Just take 5 minutes, write some stuff down. We'll talk about it. Do you understand? What do you observe about his sermon in Athens? And another, like what you just said, like what Josh was getting at, understanding the person of Paul. He knew their poets. That's interesting, that he took the time to know that about their culture. It's interesting. And like what you said, starting with that common. Faisal. Paul was able to preach in Ephesus, and the people of Ephesus riot. Again, it's financially motivated. But then the governor or the leader comes in and says, look, Paul has not blasphemed our gods. So there's a way Paul could preach the gospel in Athens and in Ephesus. The offense of the gospel is there, but Paul was not being unnecessarily offensive. I appreciate you said that. That's interesting. And keep in mind that these sermons are like notes that Luke is writing down, and Luke is getting to a point. So we know Paul's the one preaching, but we know the Spirit's the one inspiring Luke to write a certain point. And that is interesting. And what I think is interesting is that Luke makes the point he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And then the point that Luke does want to drive, like you said, he doesn't talk about, I don't think forgiveness of sins is mentioned in this sermon, but he does get to there's judgment coming, and the man who's going to judge, does he use the name Jesus, or does he say God has appointed a man who was resurrected from the dead, I believe. Does he say that? Anyway, there's a call to repentance. Now he commands all people everywhere to repent. So it is interesting, though, what Luke and what Paul are emphasizing. Yeah, that's one thing that stuck out to me. He acknowledges their religion. He doesn't seem to, like Faisal said, he doesn't seem to unnecessarily offend, but he also doesn't accept it. And he gets to God as creator, God is sovereign. God does not need humans to serve him, which would be did you have something to add, Brian? Go ahead. Okay, yeah, it doesn't need humans to serve them, which that's a massive part of pagan belief, that the people are serving the needs of the gods. He wants people to know that God is the giver of all things. God does not have needs. We learn a lot of theology about God from this sermon. God is the creator. Paul has things to teach them about humanity. It's God who made us. Our lives, where we live, where we are born, are determined by his will. Verse 26. He gets to our need for God. We talked a lot about that day one. Our need for the Spirit. Now he's telling these pagans, God does not need them. We need God. Paul calls for a response, and I want to hear what you have to say, Brian, but let me just point this out. Notice the response to the sermon in verse 32. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. Others said, we will hear you again about this. So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius, the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So I think this should encourage us that when we preach, there will always be those who will mock. There will always be those, not necessarily in our church, but over the course of our ministries, there will be those who will mock. There will be those who will want to hear again, and there will be some who will believe. And we see that illustrated again in Acts later in Paul's other sermons, that there was one of the governors who knew the gospel. He wanted to keep hearing it, but he waited till it was convenient. We'll see that played out again later in Acts. And there was something that is also played out. What was it? It's interesting in Paul's other sermons, and we'll talk about this tomorrow, but there's two things that break his audience, and they interrupt the sermon, and the sermon stops. In this one, it's the resurrection of the dead. In the ones we'll look at tomorrow, it's the resurrection of the dead and the Gentiles coming to faith. These are very important themes in Acts, and it's almost like Luke highlights it by saying, when Paul gets to this point in this sermon, the crowd goes nuts. And so it's like that's the last thing he said. And so those are themes I think we see in Acts. And it's as if Luke's highlighting that for us to pay attention to. The resurrection of the dead, gospel going to the Gentiles, very important things. Let's go ahead and we're going to jump into Paul's ministry after Athens. It says in chapter 18, verse 1. After this, Paul left Athens and he went to Corinth. Okay, now chapter 18 is going to introduce us to a lot of important people. It says he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus. Pontus, remember where Pontus is? Up here in Turkey, Asia Minor, near Bithynia. But he had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. You see, God is sovereign over the movement of peoples and the direction of emperors, so that even as Aquila is now forced by the emperor to leave Rome, there was an edict that Claudius forced all the Jews out, and now Aquila and his wife are having to go find somewhere to live. But even in all of this, God is sovereignly working to bring Paul, Aquila, and Priscilla together. I'm sure you can apply that to your life, trusting God's sovereignty over things that seemingly could go wrong. Like if someone tells you, you got to leave your home, but God is even sovereign over that. using that for his glory and for the movement of people for the advance of the gospel. Paul begins working with these guys in Corinth because it says in verse 3, because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. Verse 5, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. So I think this is one of those examples where you see Paul tells people that he was not afraid to work when he needed to, but you also see that when his teammates, so he's here working with Priscilla and Aquila, making tents, supporting his own needs and preaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath, but then when Timothy and Silas come, they're able to meet Paul's needs. Paul's able to give himself fully occupied to the word in Corinth. Aquila and Priscilla will be mentioned later, and they're a special couple. We'll talk more about them, I guess, as we go through the chapter, but what do I want to say about them before I move on? They're interesting. They're mentioned a handful of times in the Bible. Let's just look at where else they're mentioned. Okay, look at Romans chapter 16, verses 3 and 5 as we look at Priscilla and Aquila. Romans 16, verses 3 through 5. Greet Prisca and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risk their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles give thanks as well. All the churches of the Gentiles give thanks for these guys. Paul was surrounded by some really good friends over the course of his ministry. I'm sure Paul was a good friend too. But man, what great friends to risk their neck for Paul's life and to have such a ministry that all the churches of the Gentiles would give thanks for them. These are some stellar people captured by the gospel of grace. Look at, I'm sorry, I should have read verse 5 too. Let me just make this point. Romans 16:5, greet also the church in their house. So whatever this meant in the first century, when there weren't church buildings, and however big this church in their house was, we don't know, but they had a church in their house. They had enough means to do that. Go to 1 Corinthians 16, verse 19. 1 Corinthians 16. Romans 16 then, now we're looking at 1 Corinthians 16. Verse 19. It says, the churches of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Prisca, together with the church in their house, send you hearty greetings in the Lord. Okay, it doesn't exactly say, and as I was trying to piece this together, it's a little confusing, the timeline, we don't exactly know, but it appears that there's a period of time in the 50s AD, early 50s, when Priscilla and Aquila are living in Rome, and they have a church in their home. Now it appears that they're living in Asia, Ephesus, and it appears they have a church in their home. So I love this couple. It's like wherever they were going, they were having a church in their home. Neat. 2 Timothy 4:19, this would have been later in history along the timeline. This would have been in the mid-60s. 2 Timothy 4:19. Greet Prisca and Aquila in the household of Onesiphorus. Once again, he's greeting them. I guess I had more. I thought I had on that. I guess that's just a greeting on them. Anyway, just showing the point that these guys definitely walked the distance with Paul. Were an encouragement to him, and were helping in the advance of the gospel to Gentiles. It seemed they moved around a fair amount, maybe with their occupation and whatnot, and they were just examples of what we call, at least in the West, I don't know what you might call it, but bivocational ministry. Like they had a job, but they're also doing ministry. Very influential in New Testament history. And they also play a part, we're going to see in just a few verses, in a guy named Apollos' life, and in helping him to be more effective for ministry as well. Paul's work in Corinth. He's in Corinth, and we got to move quick, but what I want to talk about is, I already said this, Paul was not afraid to work when he needed to. I also wanted to say Paul was willing to work together with a team. Paul wasn't a lone ranger, so even when his guys were not with him, he was still looking for people to partner with and to work with. He wasn't a lone ranger. He worked on a team. Verse 5, it's interesting to me that in Corinth, Paul is testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. Verse 28 ends the chapter with Apollos doing the same thing. He's testifying from the scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. And that took place in Achaia, in Corinth. So something's going on in Corinth that Luke wants us to see, is that both Paul and Apollos are bringing this ministry, that Christ is Jesus, to this city. That was an important part of this message to bring out. Look at verse 7. Well, as the story goes, he's there, he's teaching, he's in the synagogue. The synagogue, what happens? Verse 6, they oppose him. They revile him. He shakes out his garments, and he says to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." He follows that same pattern. And then I find this really interesting. Verse 7, and he left there and went to the house of a man named, this is a hard one for me to pronounce, Titius, I think is how I'm going to say it, Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. So Paul's talking in the synagogue. He gets asked to leave the synagogue, and ironically, there's a house right next to the synagogue where he continues to be able to teach the word. Kind of the Lord to provide that house for Paul, and ironic to those Jews. We see, this is an interesting, I don't know if there's other places, I'm not sure, but we see the leader of the synagogue, Crispus, believes in the Lord. And another time with a whole household who are believing in the Lord. Many of the Corinthians hearing Paul believed. But then, what's interesting is, we don't know why, but Paul has a vision of Christ encouraging him. And Christ says, don't be afraid. So I don't know, was Paul afraid to work in Corinth? Paul was a man like us, we've already talked about. He could get annoyed, he could get overjoyed. Maybe he was afraid, maybe not. Regardless, what he was facing, in the kindness of the Lord provided him an encouragement in a vision of the night. Don't be afraid, go on speaking, don't be silent, I'm with you. No one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. When Moses was afraid, the Lord told Moses, I'm with you. In the Great Commission, Jesus tells his people, I'm with you, even to the end of the age. We need that encouragement today, because as we go out, as we do ministry, the Lord Jesus is with us. This encouragement that Paul received, we can receive as well. Now, Paul received a promise that no one was going to attack him. We may not have that promise, but Paul did for the sake of his ministry there. But the point is that Jesus is with us no matter what we're dealing with. Jesus has many people across the world, in our city here, in the city where I live, that he intends to save. Just one final thing I want to point out about Athens. Look at Corinth. Look at verse 17. As they're persecuting Paul in Corinth after months of work there, Jesus encourages him to stay, and then after that, there is a little bit of persecution that drives him out after a season of time. But it says in verse 17, they all seized this guy named this is hard for me, Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. And if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Sosthenes is one of the co-authors of the Corinthian letter. Paul, called by the will of God to be an apostle of Christ Jesus, and our brother Sosthenes. That was very hard for me. Sosthenes. So that just gives us a little bit of a glimpse into this man who we don't know much more about, but he was a ruler of a synagogue. Perhaps he was Crispus, that same guy, I don't know, but who was beaten and who would help Paul later write the 1 Corinthian letter. Any thoughts or questions on Corinth before we move on from Corinth? Okay. Verse 18, Paul has finished his ministry in Corinth, and he begins his journey, a journey back to Antioch, to his home church, Antioch in Syria. And there's an interesting story here that takes place that I think your reading again can help with that. It says that he, in verse 5, he set sail for Syria. That's where Antioch was. With him Priscilla and Aquila. But at Cenchrea he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow. What was the vow in the Old Testament where they would cut their hair? Nazarene vow. So it's interesting. All that's going on here, I don't know. But again, we've seen this pattern that Paul was willing to become a Jew, follow those practices at some times to help win the Jews. It's interesting. They came to Ephesus after this. Ephesus was that main city in Asia. And remember, he had tried to get there at the very beginning, but the Spirit forbade him. Now he's back, and he's only going to be there for just like a very short time, and eventually he's going to come back to Ephesus, but this is just a short time. He takes their leave quickly. He asks them some questions. He doesn't stay long. He is booking it to get back to Antioch. He goes through Caesarea in verse 22, and then he heads down to his home church in Antioch. And verse 23, after spending some time there, Luke doesn't often tell us. Luke sometimes just uses these. He spent not many days, not what is it? Not a few days. And here, he doesn't really tell us how long. It's just he spent some time in Antioch, and then he goes right on into the next missionary journey. But this concludes the second missionary journey, when he returns to his home church. Just like the first one, where he had completed the work. Now he has completed the work of the second journey, and he is home, and I'm sure he was telling them of the great things of God. But Luke's interest is to keep moving right into the third. After he spent some time with his home church, he departs and leaves Antioch again and goes back to the region of Galatia and Phrygia, doing what? Strengthening all the disciples. So this pattern again in Paul's life. He was there years before. He planted it years before, but he's still concerned about those churches in Galatia, those churches in Phrygia, maybe because they struggled with legalism. He kept going back and back and back to help them and to encourage them and to strengthen them. And how can that inform our ministry today? That's just a rhetorical question. The third mission starts in Antioch, and then he has a lot of places to go on this mission. And this, again, as Luke is writing his Acts, his book of Acts, he's not so interested in the chapters. I think he's interested in these sections. And this third missionary journey, there's going to be half of it that's in this sixth section. There's going to be half of it that it continues on into the next section. We're going to just cover now quickly getting to Ephesus, the city of Ephesus. Then we're going to be done for the day, and then tomorrow we'll finish the rest of that mission. God at work in Ephesus. That's what I want to talk about now. Okay, verse 24. There's a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, and he came to the city of Ephesus. This next 2 chapters is all about Ephesus. Apollos was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures. Just because we observe that, like, Paul is setting up shop in these bigger cities doesn't mean that others were not going to the smaller places, because, for example, we'll see this in just a moment, but Paul sets up shop in Ephesus for a while, and it says he's teaching at the hall of Tyrannus. And we'll see that in just a minute. And then everyone in the province of Asia hears the word of the Lord. So someone was coming to Ephesus, hearing Paul, and then taking it back. And you see that in Colossians. I think his name was Epaphroditus. Yeah, I think. It seems like that's obviously if the Lord lays on someone's heart to go to a village, they should think about that and pursue that. But it does seem to me that we see over and over again this work in cities when your team is small and your resources are few, and it seems to be using what God's already doing in the world to advance the gospel. It seems that way to me. I wouldn't tell someone they're wrong not to do it that way, but it seems like a good idea in Paul's day and our day. So let me tell you a little bit about Ephesus. Estimated population of over 250,000. The city was the keeper of the temple of Artemis, like James asked. Let me tell you about the temple of Artemis right now. It was the largest building, religious building, one scholar says, the largest religious building in the Hellenistic world. It was 4 times the size of the Parthenon. The Parthenon is what's in Athens. Ephesus was a major pilgrimage city. Thousands of people made pilgrimages to Ephesus every spring. There was an annual festival to Artemis. Artemis is different. She's a goddess. She's a different, she has different meaning to different places. So for example, in Perge, Artemis is a goddess of like hunting and things like that. That's how she's presented in my city where I live. Way back in the day. In Ephesus, she was presented as a goddess of fertility. I'll show a video in just a minute. And she was very important to these people. The city of Ephesus was known for being a center of magical practices. The kind of magic, and we'll see this shortly, the kind of magic that people would, they had these, they had scrolls or paper of some sort, papyrus, I don't know what they had, but they had words on them, and that was like a good luck charm that would protect them from evil spirits. And so that's the kind of magic that these is prevalent in Ephesus at the time, which will be important later. Yeah, they had meaningless words that they would recite to protect them from evil spirits. And that brings us now to what's going on with Apollos. Let's talk about Apollos, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what the Lord's doing in Ephesus. Apollos is a guy from Alexandria. Alexandria being down here in Egypt. I don't think it's on my map. I think it's right there at that delta, that river delta. I'll confirm that, but it's in Egypt. Apollos is an interesting guy to me because he's a gifted communicator. We see him all over the New Testament. He's doing great things. But he comes to Ephesus. He's arguing with the Jews about Jesus, the passage says, but he doesn't have a complete understanding of it. So he's got some kind of knowledge. He knows, I think he uses the word John the Baptist's teaching. Let's see. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, this is verse 25, Apollos spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he only knew the baptism of John. So he's trying to do ministry. He loves Jesus. He's engaging people, but he doesn't have it quite right. And that's where Priscilla and Aquila come in, this more quiet couple that comes in and helps to disciple him. I love that picture. They're discipling him. They're teaching him the way of the Lord more accurately. And then verse 27, I like this. When he wished to cross to Achaia, Corinth is in Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. When he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Christ was Jesus. So, and then verse 1 of 19, Apollos is at Corinth. So this Acts 18:27 has become, like when I sign my letters, that's what I'll put, Acts 18:27, because what I love about Apollos is that, not that I'm gifted like Apollos, I'm not. Apollos was a great speaker, I'm not. But Apollos was a man who loved Jesus. He was a man who was discipled in a city not his home, and he wanted to go to Corinth, and what he wanted to do in Corinth was to help those people, help that church in Corinth who by grace had believed. And it says he was a strong, I believe he uses the word strong. Great, he uses great. He greatly helped those who through grace had believed. And so what I see in this is like, this is I don't want to use this word. He was sent from one city to another city to help a church and to greatly strengthen them. And I think that there will be people the Lord will raise up to do that same thing. They'll be sent from one church to go help other churches and to strengthen them. Not necessarily to plant, but to strengthen and to encourage those who have already believed. And Corinth was an unreached city. Although there was a church, they needed to be strengthened so that they could continue to reach the people of Corinth with the gospel.